Alright, so this is going to be a video about the design and the build process for the sub 250 gram FPV wing that I've made. I've dubbed it the FoamTini after one of its main inspirations, the E-Wings Vortini. As you can see, it's sitting on the scale with no battery in it, but otherwise ready to fly at 183 grams. I'm flying it with two different batteries, a 3-cell and a 4-cell battery, both 650 milliamp hours, 75C. And as you can see with the 3S battery, we're well under 250 grams. For the 4S though, we started off as under 250 grams, but after some durability testing, some unscheduled landings, to the aircraft. Here we had a little bit of a crumple after a crash, and I think I've just ended up making it just a little bit over the 250 grams with the 4S battery, which is my preferred battery to fly this airplane with. But it did start off as under 250 grams when I first put it all together with this battery. So just something to be aware of. With unfortunately with that quad, you tend not to gain much weight. With an airplane, as you keep adding glue, the weight slowly does tend to increase on you. But as far as I'm concerned, that's close enough to 250 grams to I don't have any issues flying it like that. Obviously, most of you probably already know, but the whole reason for this 250 gram weight thing is for a number of countries, being over 250 grams puts you into usually a little higher level of regulation. For example, where I live in Canada, you would need a license to fly this an airplane that's over 250 grams. The airplane would have to be registered. You'd have to make sure you avoid controlled airspace because it's not on the approved manufacturer's list. You need to keep a logbook of all your flights, maintenance records, all those things, just because you are flying an RC airplane over 250 grams. So under 250 grams, basically it's back to the common sense rules of flying in areas that are reasonably safe and staying away from airports, but you don't have those fairly onerous regulations affecting you. Main goal of this airplane was obviously to be sub 250 grams, to be able to do high definition recording and FPV, as well as have a full iNav setup with GPS. And I really wanted to have performance similar to some of my larger wings in terms of speed and power and ability to carry out maneuvers. And so far it's proved itself with that. Like I said, it's one of its inspirations is the E-Wings Vortini, but also the Nano Drak and the Nano Goblin kind of all led to the inspiration to make something like this. This isn't a replacement though for a EPP wing, like for example the Vortini. This is built with a 6mm foam, similar to Depron or monoplane foam. It has some disadvantages over something like EPP. One of the main ones being in terms of when the aircraft takes some damage because of an unscheduled landing. Unlike an EPP wing, it won't tend to shrug off that damage as easily, and it's harder to repair the damage. If you look at the leading edge here, I clipped this on a soccer goal post, and you can see the foam's crushed in. And there's really not much to be done about that other than to cut the whole thing out. Whereas compared to something like an EPP wing, it probably wouldn't have even damaged it at all. And if it did damage or tear, it'd be fairly easy to glue it back together. So it's not a replacement for something like an EPP wing. You're not going to get the same level of durability or resilience like that. Yeah, started off with some foam board designs. I was looking at someone had made a 75% scale of the flight test Goblin, the FT Goblin. But I'm not a big fan of foam board, and I figured it would probably end up being too heavy to make the sub 250 gram limit. That's when I started looking around for other ideas, and I saw new products like the Nano Drak, obviously the Nano Goblin, and the E-Wings Vortini, which seemed to be a really good fit. And the only problem was they haven't released it yet. And a lot of the people that were flying it were having issues with things like CFG and actually getting it to be under 250 grams. So I had the idea to make my own. I often build with a type of foam called monoplane foam. But in this aircraft, I actually found this foam at the dollar store. It's not the Adams Ready board that the flight test aircraft use or recommend. This was a 6mm foam with no paper covering, and I'm not 100% sure what type of foam it is, but it certainly seems like it might be Depron or very similar to Depron, because it's stiffer than monoplane foam, but otherwise behaves much the same. And I cut this one out on my mostly printed CNC machine, but that was mostly for my sake, just experimenting with it and having a lot of fun. There's no reason why you couldn't cut this aircraft out with just a knife. That's what I did before I built my CNC machine, so there's nothing very complicated on it to cut out, so it wouldn't be any issue with that. So as far as the aircraft goes, I'll just go a quick overview of what's all going on with it. Obviously at the front you can see the I've chosen the Cadex Tarsier, which is a dual FPV and high definition recording camera. You can see the control board back behind the camera in the battery bay. Now you have to access this board a fair bit, so I wanted it to be easy to retrieve. So what I did is use a magnet to make it easy to retrieve that. So you can see there's a magnet embedded in the battery, the plywood plate there, and there's also a magnet here at the bottom of the 3D printed mount. And when you're want to put it back in, it just snaps into place and nicely holds there out of the way until you need to pull it out again. And if there's one thing that's maybe not the most ideal, is the size of this bay right here. It is an incredibly tight fit with these batteries that I've selected, and to get the hatch to close and get everything plugged in, I basically have to shove the plugs down here on the side, which kind of pushes it out a little bit. It could have stood to be just a few millimeters wider. And so what you could do is you could simply add another one of these pieces in, right, to have an additional, I think there's 12 pieces in here. If you added in a 13th piece, you know, you would get 6 millimeters wider, which can now give you a lot of room to maneuver your leads and have a little bit more wiggle room to get everything fitting in there. Or especially if you had a battery that was just a little bit wider than this one. Or I don't know how much strength you'd give up, but you could take out both of these. There's two full-size side pieces, these ones here, on each of the outside pieces, or these full-size pieces, and you could just go down to one on each. That would save you a bit of weight and foam, and give you the larger size space. I don't know how much strength you'd give up, but that's one way you could do it. Wanted to keep everything embedded in the foam to try and keep it as sleek as I could. So you can see I've got the VTX here in the foam. The antenna runs out to one of these True RC side feed Axie 2 antennas, I believe they're called. And then the wires, everything like that, are routed underneath the KFM2 airfoil into the main bay here. The GPS is also hidden right here. It's embedded in the foam, and the wires, of course, all run in from there. Two Emax servos. I'll have the links for all these items in the video description. These are digital. I believe they're Metal Gear. And of course all the wires again run on down to the middle here. You can see I've chosen a KFM2 airfoil for this airplane. If you're not familiar with that, it's a very simple airfoil, primarily used in scratch building RC because it's so simple, but it actually really does perform very well. It's usually a little bit more drag than a true airfoil, but the actual lift you get off it is still pretty decent. And for weight saving on this aircraft is the main reason I chose it. and over full airfoil, and of course the simplicity of the build. In the back bay, you'll see I have the flight controller, which is a Matek F411 wing, which is a fantastic flight controller for an aircraft design like this. Everything's well integrated into it. Makes it very simple to put together. You don't need any additional BECs because we're going to be using a multi-rotor ESC for this airplane, so it won't have a 5-volt BEC built in. And it does a very nice job with this aircraft. On the other side, you can see our speed controller, just a 20 amp speed controller I had sitting around. And then for the motor, I chose the Emax 1306B, 4000 kV, and I'm running a tri-blade 3-inch prop on that. And it performs very nicely. Cruises along very comfortably around 50% power on the 4S battery. Pulling somewhere just shy of a little shy of 4 amps, 3.5 to 4 amps, and performs very, very nicely with that. You can see I've added laminate to the leading edge and the nose just to help with any scrapes and stuff like that help keeping the foam in good condition. And yeah, that's the main overview for the aircraft. Now, unfortunately, I didn't take any video during the actual build process for the aircraft. However, it's a very, very simple aircraft to build, so I don't think that even if you haven't built an aircraft before, I don't think you'd have too much trouble assembling this one. To start off with, obviously you're going to need a source of foam. I've mentioned I found this particular foam at the dollar store, and it's a brand called uCreate, and this foam cost me $2.50, and it is nice and stiff. 6 millimeters thick. The only disadvantage to it is this very, very bright coloring on one side. The other side is white. So you might have to be careful with how you cut your parts out if you're not intending to have a type of paint on there that would cover that yellow, or you could just make use of that yellow and just incorporate it into the actual design. And other options for the foam are Depron, which you can get from some RC-related sites, as well as model plane foam, which I'll have a link for in the description. And finally, you could use something like Dollar Tree foam board if that's what you're familiar with and what you have access to. But I would probably be careful about that because it's a little bit thinner. So you'll have to make sure you might have to modify the plan slightly, like printing out an extra one of this middle section of the fuselage. Make sure that the fuselage stays wide enough to fit a typical battery in. Once you've got your foam, it's fairly easy to cut out. You can print the plans out on your home printer, or you can bring them to a print shop and have them print out a full sheet, which makes it a little bit easier. And once you've cut the plans out, the build process is fairly simple. You'll see we have, for assembly, there's a number of different types of glues you can use. My favorite is this type of glue called FoamTak. It's made by a company called Beacon. It works fantastic for this type of foam. Bonds very strongly. It's very quick drying glue. It takes usually about 5 minutes or so to glue. And you can even do hinges with it. You can make hinges literally out of this glue for things like your elevons. And I'll show you that later on. I'll show you kind of how to do that later on. Though there's lots of really good videos on YouTube that show you how to make use of this. Take the glue that you can use. This is Foam Cure by BSI. This one takes a little longer to dry, isn't quite as flexible, but also does a nice job, and it's a fair bit cheaper than the FoamTak. And a little bit easier. The shelf life is a little bit better. FoamTak kind of tends to solidify over time, no matter how well you try and keep the cap on. There's a number of other glues you could use. I've seen people use things like Gorilla Glue for these type of scratch builds. You can just use good old-fashioned hot glue gun, but just be forewarned that hot glue is going to be comparatively heavy. So if you're really trying to make the sub 250 gram, you probably want to use something like the FoamTak for the full build. A handful of cutouts here. You can ignore this larger cutout here that was cut out by a mistake. And then we have the cutout which will lead into the middle bay, where the flight controller will live. We have another small cutout here, which leads into the battery bay, but I found I didn't end up needing that one, so you could probably skip that one. The first hole the larger hole is for the main spar. There'll be another hole at the back here, and that's for the rear spar. Main spar is designed to be 4 millimeters. Rear spar is 3 millimeters. But you could stick with 4 for both. I probably wouldn't go much smaller than 3 millimeters though, if you outer diameter for your carbon fiber spar, or you can use something like a pine dowel, but it won't be as stiff as the carbon fiber is. So it actually comes time to build. What I did is I start with once all your little cutouts are pushed out and it's ready to be assembled, is I use the carbon fiber to act as a guide. So what I did is I ran the carbon fiber down the two posts, and then I would add glue to the side that I was adding this to. So I'd add glue onto here, and then slide it down the carbon fiber tube, so that the tubes would help keep everything in alignment. And you just keep doing that section by section, adding glue to each one as you go to laminate it together. Until you reach the point where all of them are now glued together. And the carbon spars are, like I said, sitting in the middle there, holding everything nice and true, so otherwise they will tend to be warped a little bit. And once they're all together, you'll start to see kind of the fuselage kind of come together. And I would just have this set up on its side somewhere, or just somewhere where you can kind of make sure that it stays relatively in the right shape. A little bit of tape or something on the front on a couple different parts here, just to make sure it holds together. Just a little bit of masking tape, hold everything nicely together, and maybe a little bit of weight. And let that glue dry and set up. And once that's done, you'll have a fuselage section that looks something like this, with 2 carbon spars going through the lead spar and the rear spar. And then you're on to adding the wings. And adding the wings is pretty simple. You'll have your wings set up like this, with the slots for the spars already cut out. And all you do is now attach that like that. What I did when I was gluing this on to make life a little bit easier is I just set up some wood blocking so that the design would be resting on these wings, and then I would add glue to this spar slot, put the spar in, maybe a little bit of tape on top just to protect it, and then add some weight just to make sure that spar glues in there really nicely. And then next you're going to be looking at the KFM2 airfoil. So this part is cut out to sit on top of the main wing sheet right here. And you'll notice in the plans there'll be cutouts on the side that you want to add it to here, which looks kind of like this. This is actually the opposite side one, but just going off what I got for scraps here. So this is actually the GPS bay, which would be sitting over here, but we'll just use it in here for demonstration because it'll work anyway. And if you want to keep everything as sleek as you can, you'll make use of those pockets or cutouts to hide all the wiring. So basically you actually add the electronics to the KFM, the top airfoil, or the top part of the KFM2 airfoil. And then once those electronics have been added to the bottom here, glued in, then you can set it back down on top of the main wing and just go through the same process again of gluing it down. Now once it's glued down and this is all sitting attached to the aircraft like this, you're going to want to sand this leading edge, because this leading edge is that's not very aerodynamic at all. And if you're using model plane foam or Depron or this uCreate foam, it's very easy to do. Once this is finished gluing and setting up and it's a nice strong bond, just take something like a sanding sponge or just sandpaper, and you're just going to sand it into a nice leading edge profile. You don't have to be too concerned about how perfect or how even this is. It's still going to fly, even if you don't get it perfectly even all the way across the board. As you can see, I already pointed out, I think, but mine's got a nice dent in it, and that doesn't seem to affect the flight profile at all. So don't be too concerned about how perfect you have to get this leading edge. The trailing edge I left mostly alone on mine. However, I did sand the trailing edge of the elevons, and as well as the leading edge and trailing edge of the vertical stabilizers, just to give it a little bit less drag, make it a little bit more aerodynamic going into there. So the front has a nice rounded edge. The trailing edge is kind of sanded to a point on any of the trailing edge points, and I also sanded back where the motor, or back inboard of the vertical stabilizers. I sanded that down a little bit as well. Once you finish sanding the wing, what you're going to want to do is install the elevon. Now I've attached my elevons with foam tack. One of the nice things about it is it stays very flexible after it's been used, and you can make use of that to actually create glue hinges. So if you take a look at the elevon hinge here, you can see that there's no tape, there's no physical hinge. The only thing that's holding this together is the foam tack glue. And to use this, all you do is run a bead of the foam tack glue along the leading edge of the elevon, and then hold it up against the wing where you want to attach it to. Give it just a second or two to make contact with that and transfer some of the glue over to the wing, and then you pull the elevon off. Then you give it about 30 seconds or so, and then you actually put it back on, and now the two parts of the glue hinge, because this foam tack is basically a rubber cement, they'll make contact with each other and bond, and they'll form a very, very strong bond, which won't come apart in flight, that's for sure. There's quite a bit of strength there. The only thing you need to make sure you do is don't get too much glue into where the bevel is here, because that'll tend to gum up the mechanism. So just make sure there's no glue hiding out in there, and that the elevon will move nice and smoothly. That's the same thing I did actually for the Corex hatches. So when you cut this out, this is Corex, which is a 5mm. Kind of looks like cardboard, except it's made out of plastic instead. And we've used this for the hatches here. And I made the same thing. I used the foam tack to make the hinge right here, using the same technique as the elevons. You can see this one I've had to repair a little bit after some crashes, but it is quite strong. There's nothing but glue holding that on there. So it makes an excellent, relatively lightweight hinge. Once it's sanded, and you'll have most of your electronics in, the last kind of steps are going to be setting up the electronics. So running all your wiring into your flight controller here in the back bay. Get that all set up. I added laminate to the leading edge, but you can also use tape, just something to give the leading edge just a little bit of protection for when you inevitably hit something with it. And like I said, once you're done setting up the electronics, you'll want to add the motor mount in. And I'll have the link posted too. I've got two motor mounts. This is the more complex style, a more heavier style, but it had some system where you could attach and remove this from the airplane. So if you wanted to be able to change the motor, you could use this. I do just caution you that it is a little bit heavier, and it does make it a little bit harder to make C a G because it puts a little bit more weight at the tail. This isn't, I ended up removing this and going to the simpler motor mount, but that motor mount you just glue in. There's nothing complex about it. Once your motor's installed, you have to make sure the motor's installed first, because you can't get access to where the screws are once it's installed. And then you glue the motor mount on, a little bit of tape or pins or something like that to hold it in the right spot, and then just let the glue dry. And then once you're all done with all that, your speed control, everything's all wired up, then you're going to put the vertical stabilizers on. And the vertical stabilizers, if you're following the plans, I would have told you to mark it here. There's some dotted or dashed lines that show where the vertical stabilizers are supposed to go. And so all you do is just slide this in. And the whole reason that is labeled like that is because there's a little bit of a toe in, which means that the stabilizer is sitting with the front of it angled in a little bit, fairly minor. And that's just to give it a little bit of better wind resistance. So last step is to glue these on, because they're make it the whole airplane a lot more awkward to work with once they're on. So I keep them off until the very end, and only glue them on when I'm absolutely finished with it all. And that's basically the extent of the build video. So like I said, fairly simple. Even if you've never built something before, there's nothing particularly complex about this design. So I think that anybody should be able to build it. So final thoughts on the plane. I'm very happy with how it's flying. You can obviously see the videos yourself on my channel here. And if this is something you're interested in building, like I said, I'll have the plans listed as well as all the components listed below in the description. It's a fairly easy plane to build, fairly quick to build. I'm still dealing with the Cadex Tarsier here. Trying to figure out what the best settings are for it, how to kind of get the best video out of this particular setup. I'm not totally sold on the Tarsier yet. I've noticed the optical image stabilization doesn't seem to handle this sort of flying very well anyway. The 4K is only 30 frames a second, so it tends to look quite blurry when you're actually flying down low. The 2.7K is actually distorted, which you have to correct in post, which is one of those things that hardly makes any sense to anybody, I think. And finally, I noticed that it seems to affect the GPS, because when I first start this airplane up before flying, I'll actually pull the Cadex Tarsier up out of here and actually turn it off. And I found if I don't turn it off, it can take almost a very long time, almost as many as 10 minutes to acquire enough satellites, for the GPS to acquire enough satellites. I've noticed if I turn the Tarsier off, then those satellites will pick up much quicker, much more like I'm used to with an INF setup with a BN220 GPS in it. So that's just something to be aware of. I'm not entirely convinced that this is the best option for this thing. Obviously, if you don't care about high definition recording, you can just stick a regular FPV camera up there and you won't have any issues. And that is actually the one area where the Tarsier is really nice, is the FPV feed is fantastic on it. So it's just that high definition recording that has some flaws. So yeah, so that's my build. I mean, let me know if you have any questions down below. Like I mentioned before, I'm already working on version 2 of this, which will have a slightly shorter wingspan to save us a little bit of weight, and I'll probably switch it to a KFM 4 airfoil because that one's supposed to handle wind a little bit better. If you are wondering about or don't want to get into thing before you get into version 2, I am intending to use the full set of electronics exactly the same. I'll probably just move them over from this frame into the version 2 frame, so all of these components should still work. If you're going to build this thing replacing components, be very careful about weights, especially for the motor, because to get this thing to balance, you need to make sure that you do not end up with too much weight at the back of the airplane. So just something to be aware of. Just like its inspiration, the E-Wings Vortini, people have had a lot of issues with getting the CFG far enough forward, and if you put a bigger motor on the back here, like an 1806, I think you will struggle to get the weight up, or struggle to get the center of gravity in the right spot. So just something to be aware of if you're substituting equipment on this wing, that there isn't a lot of room to put the battery in where it can affect the CFG significantly. Obviously, if you don't have the Tarsier without this in the way, then you can get the battery a lot further forward, which would solve that. But if you're intending to keep most of the same stuff, just be aware of that in terms of weight. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you decide to build this wing, I certainly would like to know, and see if you post any pictures or video of it. And if you do build it, I hope it works well for you. I'm having a lot of fun with mine, and I'll be continuing to post video with flying it, and certainly once version 2 comes around, I'll have updates and updated plans with that one as well. Thanks a lot.